We are very excited today to have two wonderful speakers doing work in conservation and restoration. And I want to give them as much time as possible. So yes, I'll just briefly introduce myself. We do a lot of water conservation here, and we do work with our stakeholders on policy issues, and are doing this brown bag series. So let me read actually what Cameron wrote about himself as introduction to him. He's our first speaker. And before Lily Christopher speaks, I'll introduce her as well. So Cameron is the Land Protection and Stewardship Manager. He wrote that he is a fourth generation Smithsonian and grew up exploring and enjoying the outdoors from the Sky Islands down to the Sea of Cortez. He says, my work with the Trust allows me the opportunity to make a difference in these open spaces and working landscapes. I couldn't ask to work with a better team of people who share my passion for conserving the legacy and resources that make our community such an amazing place to live. All right, well, welcome, Cameron, and we will go forward with your talk about restoration.
Thanks, Marianne. Let me pull up my presentation really quick.
I think I have to stop.
So hopefully that's pulled up okay. Yeah, so I really appreciate the introduction. Again, my name is Cameron Becker. I'm with the Arizona Land and Water Trust. I appreciate you letting me come present today and getting the invitation. So some of the things that I'll talk about in my portion is just some of the basics of what a land trust is, some basics of real property ownership, the things that allow us to do the conservation work that we do at our organization. And then I'll give some examples of recent projects, more specific to Cochise County, and talk about some of our other programs briefly. Again, so I'm with 501c3 nonprofit based here out of Tucson, the Arizona Land and Water Trust. We were founded in 1978, and our overarching mission is to protect Southern Arizona's rural heritage of working farms, ranches, wildlife habitat, and the waters that sustain them. We've protected almost 60,000 acres in southeastern Arizona, with a little over 20,000 of that is something that's called a conservation easement that I'll dig into a little bit more. And we really started off back in the late 70s, early 80s, helping to lead the effort to allow conservation easements to be allowed in Arizona through legislation. Yeah, so just generally a land trust is a nonprofit organization that works with willing landowners, community stakeholders, to conserve land and water by entering into private voluntary conservation agreements. And just again, so I'm not sure where everybody's from. Arizona Land and Water Trust is one of the largest land trusts in the state of Arizona, but we're one of about 1,300 land trusts across the country. And different land trusts have varying missions. We're an agricultural land trust. We focus on working with farms and ranches, but some really focus on community access to parks or specific trails, things like that. So I'd encourage you, if you have different parts of the country, to look up your local land trust, because there's a lot of really cool people doing great work all over the place out there. So I'm sure many of you have seen a map similar to this, but I think it's an important context for a lot of the work that we do. So this is really just showing a lot of the public lands. It includes tribal lands in there as well, and showing their prominence out in the Western United States. Then zooming into Arizona, we really have an interesting mix of tribal lands. You know, you see the blue trust lands in there, a lot of Forest Service, and then the gray in between is private lands. And that's really what our nonprofit focuses on, is the private lands kind of in between a lot of those other federal and mixed jurisdictions. Which leads me right into the 5 basic elements of property ownership that I'll talk about that allow us to do this work. And briefly, those are possession, control, exclusion, enjoyment, and disposition. So the first element of private property ownership is possession. So owning property, owning title, having it in your name. Second would be control, is the things that you're allowed to do with that property. If you have water rights or mineral rights, timber rights, the ability to use those resources to to sell or use or other way manipulate. Exclusion. So you're able to put up private property, no trespassing signs. If you own a piece of ground, you're not forced to allow the public onto it. And then also enjoyment. So if you have a piece of property, you can develop that. You can use it for cattle grazing to grow crops. You can build homes on it. And then of course, disposition. So if you own a property, you can leave it to your heirs, your children, family, or you can sell it on the open market. So I know it's kind of a simple overview, but I think it's important before talking about sort of the conservation work that our organization does. I know my supervisor doesn't love this bundle of stick analogies, but I think it kind of really gets the point across. So the most basic transactions that we do for conservation are fee title acquisitions. So if you look and think about those rights that I just talked about as a bundle of sticks, a fee title acquisition is the most basic one. If you've sold or bought a home, you're transferring all those rights that you have to somebody else. An example of this is, it's again, a voluntary sale or donation to conservation buyer. It's based on appraised values. So Arizona Land and Water Trust has done a lot of work kind of connecting farmers or ranchers who are interested in seeing a property protected as open space or as agricultural use that maybe either don't have heirs, don't have children, or they have an idea of how they want to see it protected. And we kind of play a role in connecting those two. So an example I have up here is the Triangle Bar Ranch. It's about 1,000 acres. This is actually in Pinal County, so a little bit north and west of Cochise, but it contains portions of the old Camp Grant military reservation, as well as Putnam Springs and the Camp Grant Wash, and covers approximately 8-mile stretch of the San Pedro River. So we were able to work with the landowner who was aging, didn't have heirs that he was going to pass the property on to, as well as Arizona Game and Fish Department, who had a heavy interest in protecting that for wildlife habitat. They were able to use Arizona Heritage Funds, which are generated from lottery sales, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Section 6 funds to purchase the property from that landowner. But they also had an agreement to be able to continue running their agricultural operations there. So it was a really win-win for both parties. But above and beyond those kind of more simple, straightforward transactions of transferring properties from private sellers to conservation buyers is something called a conservation easement. And this is a lot more of what the work we've been doing recently is focused on conservation easements. So a conservation easement is a legal agreement between a landowner and an entity such as a land trust like Arizona Land and Water Trust that permanently restricts certain specific activities on a property to protect their conservation values. So again, that bundle of sticks analogy that I know isn't perfect, but it's really, instead of transferring that entire bundle of sticks, property rights, you're only taking one, maybe two, a couple of those things and transferring them to the land trust. Typically what will happen these, again, because our focus is on keeping agricultural lands in place, is the limiting subdivisions, new housing developments will typically limit things like mining, some timber harvesting, things like that. Every conservation easement, again, in that legislation that our organization helped pass, they're always voluntary. They're typically permanent. There's some examples of shorter term conservation easements, but they're not as common. And they're attached to the land permanently. So when you sell the piece of property after the conservation easement's in place or pass it to your heirs, those restrictions stay in place. But they generally allow the status quo of reasonable, responsible land use, typically ranching, agricultural productions, to continue. But it also has to be for a conservation purpose that benefits the local community and the state of Arizona. Yeah, so some specifics just to our organization. So our conservation easements almost exclusively do not restrict reasonable, responsible ranching, but we do prevent subdivision and development that's incompatible with those rural agricultural uses as well as wildlife habitat. From our perspective, again, these tools really work well to further our mission of protecting habitat and connectivity, providing development buffers around communities, and preserving land for agricultural use. Then from the family's perspective, again, a lot of the folks that we work with are typically older, maybe either don't have children or the children have moved into the city or out of the state and aren't interested in taking over the operation. I'm sure everybody's seen headlines like these, that most of our agricultural community, the people running these farms and ranches, are elderly or getting elderly. and there's not a whole lot of people coming in to continue this. So the threat of development of these places is really real. This is a little older statistic, but between 1982 and 2012, over 1.1 million acres of rural land was lost to development here in Arizona. And some other benefits. So a lot of times we work with families, there's typically a financial payment for those development rights that are assessed by a third-party appraisal, but those funds can be used to either buy some new infrastructure, purchase cattle, fix up some water lines, wells, things like that. And those aren't subject to restriction by the land trust. But a lot of times that influx of cash can be really helpful for landowner's operation. And so the other thing, one of my other main hats I wear at the Arizona Land Water Trust is I'm our stewardship manager. So we're in, these are recorded documents in the local county, but it's our job to make sure that the things that are placed into there, the restrictions in place, are met into the future. So that's one of my jobs. I get to go out and have a cup of coffee, tour the property with the landowners, and make sure that things are being met. And every conservation easement is unique. So it's not like a one size fits all sort of thing. Just like every rancher or farmer's operation is unique. We work through the terms together before coming to the conclusion. And just wanted to highlight, so we work with a lot of different funding sources from Arizona Game and Fish Department, Bureau of Land Management. We've got a partnership with Fort Huachuca, the Department of Defense, and Department of Agricultural Natural Resources Conservation Service, another one of our big partners. And I wanted to talk about a couple really specific examples, trying to focus in on Cochise County. So we were able to protect 1,000 acres of the Sandhill Farm with Blanton and Betty Belk. This is one of our older projects in the Whitewater Draw area. We were able to complete that in 2011. The property is really beautiful. Again, I get to go out there at least once a year, meet with them. Contains about 2 miles of the Whitewater Draw, was funded by Fish and Wildlife Service. I believe Game and Fish put some money up for this as well. They grow, I think it's about 11 acres of millet every year that they just leave out on the ground for the migrating sandhill crane, which is really great. Just really good partners in conservation. And really, I believe it was through our connection with the Sandhill Farm, they connected with us with a few of their neighbors who we've since been able to work with on conservation agreements, both the San Ysidro Farm, around 340 acres, and the Torn Rose Farm, which are 42 acres. They're downhill, basically between Sandhill and the Whitewater Draw wildlife area. And we were able to partner again with the Natural Resources Conservation Service to complete those projects in, I think it was, 2016. And then even more recently, just upstream from Sandhill, we were able to protect a little over 2,000 acres of the Tombstone Ranch. This one's a really cool big property of alkali saccatone grasslands that had been plotted for development in the early 2000s when the real estate market was really booming. They had broken it up into, I think it was 60 different parcels with the idea that they were going to transfer it out of agricultural use into more rural development. And when the economy turned down, they reached out to us and a local rancher, and we were able to combine forces to protect the property and keep it in agricultural use, just west of the town of Elfrida. We were able to partner with both the landowner, a local rancher, Arizona Game and Fish Department, Quail Forever and Pheasants Forever to protect this just last year. And something interesting about this property that's different than most of our other ones, working with Game and Fish and Quail Forever, we're allowing for seasonal public access to the private land for the purpose of hunting on foot seasonally. So now with that property, there's been nearly 5,000 acres of the Whitewater Draw protected north of the 1,500 acre Whitewater Draw wildlife area. That's a lot of other partners and really focused on protecting the properties with those private landowners. And so I don't want to take up too much time, but I also would be remiss not to talk about the Sentinel Landscape Program, which is a big impact there in Cochise County. So it's focused kind of around the Fort Huachuca. And the idea with these is where conservation, working lands, and national defense interests converge. And again, so a big portion of the Sentinel landscape is in Cochise County, a bit in Pima and in Santa Cruz. And it's similar to the larger picture of the state I showed earlier, where it's really a mix of Private lands here in gray, state trust lands, and federal lands. And what really makes this interesting is, so Fort Huachuca obviously is the anchor from Department of Defense standpoint. There's also the San Pedro National Riparian Area, Las Ciénegas National Conservation Area, and different portions of Coronado National Forest, all kind of converging in this area, and everybody's got an interest in preserving it. Some of the big drivers were a 2014 Fish and Wildlife Biological Opinion. So a big focus of the group is protecting the high altitude habitat for species like Mexican spotted owl, the lower lying grasslands, with a particular focus on agave, the recently delisted lesser long-nosed bat, and of course the riparian areas that are important for basically everything. And yeah, so again, just highlighting some of the properties. So this one actually straddles the Cochise County, Santa Cruz County border, but we worked with the landowners of the Diamond Sea Ranch some years ago to protect about 1,600 acres. It's also adjacent to the Audubon Research Ranch. Not all of this was just Arizona Land Water Trust. Nature Conservancy did a lot of work as well, but almost 6,000 acres of the Babacomari Ranch, which is a main tributary into the San Pedro, it's also been protected under this partnership. And then kind of tying into our next talk, the Circle Z Ranch, which is just south of Patagonia, we were able to work with that family, I think it was in 2013, to protect over 3,000 acres of their property to keep it, again, they run an active guest ranch, but to keep it as open space and keep their operations going. Again, so a lot of work has been done in this area. This is just kind of a highlight. Nature Conservancy is doing a lot of work, the Cochise County Recharge Network, but that's kind of a whole presentation in and of itself. I'm sure we could have another time. And lastly, I'll wrap this up by mentioning my coworker, Bailey Kennett, runs our Desert Rivers program, and they work to explore water lease agreements with willing landowners to secure water for the environment and also sustain their agricultural operations. I'll highlight one project here. Again, this is actually on that same Triangle Bar property that I talked about earlier, but it's a partnership with Arizona Game and Fish Department, converting about 100 acres that were formerly in a cotton and wheat rotation to lower water use native grasses, promoting wildlife habitat. They're also doing some cottonwood and willow plantings. And to date, through that agreement we've been working on, they've protected about 920 acre feet or around 300 million gallons of water. With that, I think I'll wrap up, and I think we're going to do questions at the end, so I'll just stop sharing and pass it over to Lily.
Great, thank you, Cameron. Actually, I think we could do some questions now for you, just because your presentation's, I'm going to switch it up a bit.
Yeah, for sure.
Fresh in people's minds. If anyone has a question, we can ask him now. Yeah, I was wondering about, Glenn, did you have a question?
Yes, Cameron, does your outfit oversee the Krenz Ranch Trust?
We don't. So just generally knowing the Krenz family, I imagine that's probably part of the Malpai Borderlands group.
Yes, okay, that's it.
I should have mentioned them. They're doing some really cool work down there, really in the southeastern corner.
Okay,
but very similar.
How many agencies similar to yours in Malpai exist in our state?
Not as many as we would like. So we're probably the largest. We've got a staff of 6 right now. There's Malpai. There's a couple of smaller ones kind of around the Phoenix area, and there's a Central Arizona Land Trust doing really good work. And then it's really just kind of national groups. Trust for Public Land and Nature Conservancy are the other 2 really big players. I know that Borderlands has kind of a spin-off group doing kind of similar work right around Patagonia. I don't know if Lily maybe will talk to that, but yeah.
Are you familiar with the one called ACES in the Udall law firm?
I don't know ACES.
Okay. I may talk to you separately then. I don't want to dominate the questions and cut off somebody else.
No, Glenn, I'll put my contact information in the chat. It'd be great to talk.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious. Well, I might have missed something when you beginning of your presentation regarding people's applications to do a conservation easement. Do you always say yes?
Oh, that's a really good question, actually. a lot of times, I should have mentioned that our limiting factor is typically funding. So we don't have any strong state program to do this. It's mostly based on federal programs. Sometimes landowners are in a position where they can donate those development rights, but usually an influx of cash, either with retirement, to pay off a mortgage, to put into their operation. So that's one aspect of it is, there's plenty of properties that we would love to do, but it's finding the funding, writing grants. But there are also people that will reach out to us where it's just not compatible with our mission. Either it's, right next to a place that's being developed, it's slated for develop for the local community. So we don't want to, they don't work necessarily for everywhere. We're going to need to develop some places. People have to live certain places where this just really isn't a good fit. And unfortunately, we tend to have to say no more times than we can say yes, but that's mostly due to funding.
It's nice that people want to do it. Hopefully there'll be more resources. And so you obviously kind of consider the connectivity with other habitats of like migrating animals and so forth, but it doesn't necessarily have to have connectivity at this point. Property.
It's not absolutely necessary. Again, we do work with more active properties, farms and ranches, but really that is something big that we look at. So overlaying wildlife corridors, we do a lot of geospatial analysis. So we have kind of our in-house shop where we do a lot of that. When a property owner comes to us and says, hey, I'd really love to protect my property, we look at all those different values, especially when we can reach out to somebody like Game and Fish or Fish and Wildlife Service and say, hey, here's a really conservation-minded rancher or property owner. Like, are you willing to put some resources towards them doing this protection work they want to do?
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. I did not know about all these ranches and properties. It was just amazing. I loved it. Well, great work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got any burning questions or otherwise? Here's your chance.
Yeah, I did put my email in there. So please feel free to reach out if anything comes up or want to talk to me outside of this. Be great.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. All right. Well, we'll move on to Lily Christopher. And she works with Borderlands Restoration, which does also work in restoration and education and outreach and lots of things, propagating seeds, plants, and so forth. She will tell you more. I'm going to introduce her also in her words. Lily says that she was born in Montana, and that's true, and raised in Tucson. Lily has spent the last 17 years falling in love with the Sonoran Desert and surrounding Sky Islands. Who wouldn't? After 2 years of studying local flora and fauna during a field series course through her high school, she decided to study at the University of Arizona and graduated in 2016 with a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences with an emphasis in land, air, and water. That same summer, she began work with Borderlands Earth Care Youth Program, Bessie in Douglas, great program. After 2 seasons of summer work in Douglas, she moved to Patagonia to work year-round to help coordinate the Bessie program. In 2019, she left Patagonia to work on a flower farm and teach English in Spain. This spring, she made her way back home to southern Arizona to be closer to family, the mountains, and the incredible biodiversity and beauty within the area. Lily says she's lucky enough to be able to continue her passion and continue learning about dryland restoration within the native plant program for whom she works at the moment. All right, welcome, Lily. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, that's from that's the bio from our website, and I'm like, wow, it's really extensive. I haven't read that one in a while, but thank you so much. So today I'm going to be talking. Cameron, also I have to thank you for such a great presentation. I think land trust. That's how that was my first internship, and they're near and dear to my heart, and it's one of the best things you can do for conservation. So I really, really, really am in support of everything your organization does. Today, I'm going to talk about a really specific project that our Native Plant Materials program has been working on since 2019. I'm going to talk about restoring Emory Oak habitat in Smith Canyon. Borderlands Restoration Network focuses on reconnecting people, wildlife, and water in the Arizona-Sonora Borderlands region. And like I said, I work for the Native Plant Materials program as the project lead. So why Emory Oaks? Well, Quercus emoryii, it's one of the most widespread oaks in our region. So as far as starting a large scale restoration project, it was kind of low-hanging fruit in that way. It's also great forage for wildlife, small mammals, and wildlife of all sizes really depend on this Emory Oak, on the Emory Oak acorns for survival. It's a host for over 200 plus butterfly and moth larvae, as well as a handful of other insects. So it's really a keystone species to these ecosystems in which we live in. It's also essential for large mammal habitat connections. I know that was something that we were talking about, connectivity in Cameron's presentation. That's something that we're definitely focused on maintaining with this project as well. So large mammals such as mountain lions, bears, even the jaguar. It's also a cultural food source. So a lot of indigenous groups call this the sweet acorn because it's the acorn with the least amount of tannins. So people don't have to process them to eat them. So it's, and also even when we talk about the UNESCO World Heritage Site of having Tucson be the first American city of gastronomy, this is one of the species that played into that designation. So it's a really important species that we really depend on many different levels. Okay, so why Smith Canyon? So Smith Canyon is this green, bright green area right here. And then you can see Sierra Vista, Sonoita, Patagonia, and then the Huachuca. This is all this green is Coronado National Forest, the Huachuca Mountains, and then the Santa Rita Mountains. And it was designated that if we could connect this portion, this little lime green portion, that we would be connecting 1.75 million acres of wildlands. And this is a 250 acre portion. So as a network, we were like, that's, pretty much a no-brainer. We should really focus on preserving this area. Okay, so, and this is just a little bit of a close-up just to give you this is Patagonia, and then this is the area. So this is actually a bigger area than Patagonia itself. And in Smith Canyon, these are kind of the oaks that we're dealing with. They're big, mature oaks that have been there for many years. But pretty much all of the oaks in this area are older, mature oaks. And you can see there's like some mesquites over here, and mesquites are becoming the dominant species within this canyon. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So over the course of the last 100 years, we've gone through historic habitat change. And so these top photos up here, this is repeat photo documentation from 1895 and 1994. And the top left is the one from 1895. And these images are taken from Changing Mile by R.M. Turner. And in that book, he writes about these beautiful oak stands that are just meandering along the riparian areas. And then he goes back, in his book, he writes about the 1994, the difference, and the difference is that there are no grasses and the mesquites are moving in. So all of these smaller shrubs here, these are all mesquites. And his biggest difference is that all of the trees that were there in 1895 are still there, but there are no young trees. So there are no small saplings or anything like that. And a similar thing, this is only a 60-year period, but the same thing from 1937 to 1995. And the biggest difference is no more grasses and then mesquite dominated. And then in this picture, he attributes it to mostly drought. So some other things that threaten the habitat of these Emory oaks in our area are drought, which we all just lived through 2020. We thought it couldn't get any worse. There was no monsoon. It definitely got worse. But there has been a long-term drought in this area. Overgrazing, a lot of these places have been grazed. And so that the overgrazing makes these landscapes susceptible to mesquites moving in at a really high rate. Oak cutting, mesquites or oaks have been historically a favorite firewood. And so that's less of a problem now, but we are still feeling the detriments of oaks being cut down 100 years later, 150 years later. So, and then loss of water flow. So groundwater pumping, and then also this long-term drought we've been in are all affecting the Emory oak habitat. Wildfire suppression, that's another big lesson of summer 2020. Horrible, horrible wildfires. And then plant disease and pathogens. The biggest one that's threatening these oaks is one called sudden oak death. It's the Phytophthora. And it is a waterborne pathogen that's moving down the West Coast. And it's moving down the West Coast, and it is waterborne. So because we're so arid here, we're less susceptible to it, but it is still something to consider moving forward. Okay, so like I said, we're dealing with a 250-acre parcel of land. It is also Cameron mentioned it before, but it's the Borderlands Wildlife Preserve. So this is our version of land conservation in a similar way. And so, but our restoration strategy for this particular area was to protect existing seedlings, support older and established oaks, propagate and plant acorns and seedlings, and monitor. So protecting existing seedlings, we did this by doing caging, and we did brush caging, tall tree tubing, and then wire caging. But to get off the ground, we did a survey of the 250 acres to just see what kind of oak seedlings and saplings we were dealing with. And we found very few, but some saplings that were 1 to 3 feet tall. And so all of those we built wire caging around, just because those were ones that were already doing well. They were already on the verge of establishing. And so that was our first and foremost thing that we did. Then we went back and we found some clusters of seedlings like this, and we built brush cages around them. And just brush that we could find around. And we did that to protect these little oaks from trampling or being grazed upon. And then the last thing we did is we did these tall tree tubings, which I don't know if you can see all that well, but they're these blue little plastic things here. And so we would go and we would find little tiny seedlings, and we put plastic tubing around all of them to protect them in a similar way as the brush cages do. The next thing we did is we decided we wanted to support older and more established oaks. And the way that we did that is we did that by pruning the low-hanging dead limbs or diseased limbs. So basically our strategy was fire mimicry. So we were like, if these limbs would have been taken out by a small fire, they're gonna go now. And the other thing that we did is we cleared all the brush from the bottom of the oaks, brush that would typically be burned in a small fire or something like that. And then using the brushes, we used those to make some of the brush cages that we ended up building. But we also, we do a lot of watershed restoration work in the wildlife preserve. And so we made a lot of like brush walls out of those. So it was mutually beneficial in a lot of ways. Okay, so then we had a very ambitious goal for 2020 of planting 1,000 acorns in this area. And so we started getting that off the ground by, we put tarps out and we collected probably 2,000 to 3,000 acorns, and we float tested all of them. So, and float testing means we checked the viability of all of them. So we put them all in a bucket, and we added water into it and left it for 24 hours. And the ones that sank are the viable seeds, and then the ones that float are the non-viable seeds. And the non-viable seeds we ended up just redistributing out into the wildlands for forage for wildlife, or for or just to decompose naturally. And then the sinkers we ended up covering with some of the brush and debris that we ended up collecting from supporting the older trees. And we put all that as a layer on top, and we allowed these acorns to germinate. They typically germinated within like a couple days, sometimes as little as 24 hours, but we waited until they had radicals about 1 to 2 inches before we decided they were ready for planting. And then we had big planting events. One of the fun things about our funding source is that it allowed us to hire an oak intern, which is Sarah, who was Sarah Ramirez, to our left. And so she was doing this day in and day out, and we just had a great time. So we literally went into this area, and we, with 1,000 acorns, and dug a hole for each acorn, put in a bamboo stake, put plastic tubing around it, and buried it in, and watered it in. But it was a huge effort. It took pretty much the whole native plant materials team to get this done this summer, because we wanted to get it in before the monsoon started, which never really happened, but it was a good thought. Yeah, so that was it. That was our biggest population effort that we did so far, that we've done so far. The other thing that we did is, and we continue to do, is growing and planting seedlings. So this picture to the left, I love this little picture. It's the picture of the oaks just sprouting, and I just think they're such a magnificent color, that like red color. And then the picture to the right is them after about 6 or 7 months. Oaks are really, really slow growing, and a lot of the acorns are not, even the sinkers were non-viable. So they have a really low germination rate, and they're really slow growing, and they do not like to be disturbed. So as a nursery plant, they're very difficult to work with. But this is something that, as our funding continues, we're continuing to sort through and deal with on a, we're just coming up with way better strategies as to like how to transplant these guys, because they don't really like it at all. And then we would go back and monitor. So we would see, we would go back and water, and we water basically everything that we had in cages with a giant, one of those giant cubes. And so we go back and water, and we did that pretty much once a season, or we had done that pretty much once a season. So every 2 or 3 months we'll go out, and we'll just, with our giant cube, and pretty much be out there all day. The thing that we've also done more often is check cage integrity. So some of the cages worked out really, really well, and some of them didn't, but some of them were like blown over by wind, or dug up by javelina, or things like that. And we would go in periodically and fix those. And then the other thing that we've done is we've done data collection. So figuring out how many acorns germinated and sprouted, how many are still alive, where they are, and maybe how they're, exactly where they are in a GPS point, and then also the status of their livelihood, basically. And so that's something we've been doing so far. Also, we've been doing it seasonally while we do watering. So yeah, pretty much our 2020 outcomes so far. Many of the acorns germinated, and so the first time we went around and monitored, a lot of the acorns were alive, but they did not end up surviving into the fall. So that following time that we came, they were not, a lot of them had not made it. So yeah, so that just tells us a lot of different things. Also, it's really difficult with the level of drought that we were dealing with this year, that I think that none of us could have predicted. The older, more established oaks are looking great, and a lot of them even have new growth after being pruned and having the brush cleared from their bases, which is a great sign considering how stressful of a year it was for the oaks. The brush and wire caging held up really, really well, and the ones that were protected in that way did really well. But the plastic tubing was too flimsy, and it was a tactic that we used because we were trying to plant 1,000 acorns. So we just needed a lot of it, and we didn't have a lot of time to get all this stuff in the ground. So that's just a lesson in that regard. But all of this has helped us. We have another year. Oh no. We have another year of funding for this project, and we have a lot of really great ideas on how to make it better. And I think the first and foremost is to focus on fewer and quality oaks to put into the landscape. So if we could get oaks that are kind of similar to the picture in the background here, somewhat about 1 foot to 3 feet tall before we can put them in the landscape, and then really baby them once they're out there. Do the like wire caging, do the best of the best, go out once a week or once a month to monitor. And yeah, and just even if we could pare that down to if 20 or 50 oaks, and really make sure those survive, because once into the future, in a couple years, once those are established, then you kind of just could get it to snowball in a really positive way where you could just plant more and more. But right now we're just really starting at square one. So we really just need to get a few established to then promote a healthier population. We also want to do more support for older established trees because that worked so well for us. But the problem, like not a problem, but a consideration with that is that it just takes, it's really laborious. Like we had a crew of 3 people out there, basically one tree a day for a crew of 3 people, which is just, I mean, that's just a lot to put into one tree. But like I said about focusing on fewer oaks, if we can have healthier older trees, then you're creating more microclimates for these seedlings and saplings to exist in. So, and then more support for newly planted trees. The watering, I mean, if there was one thing we could have done, it would be water. And we know that now, and we know that we are in a more extreme drought than we initially thought. And so we can manage our time better and manage our project funding better to be supporting those newly planted trees. And then more time spent monitoring, collecting data like soil moisture and soil type, and figure out which trees are doing well, and really pinpoint as to why they're doing well. And I think that's all I have for you. Thank you guys. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Lily. That was awesome. What a great project. What an interesting tree, kind of stubborn and independent.
I totally agree. It's one of my favorites.
We have them over here in the Mule Mountains, and they're just great. Yeah, I had not heard that term, and please, anyone jump in with questions like Babylon. I did not be familiar with that term, fire mimicry. Could you explain? I heard it in the context of the pruning at the lower levels where fire would come through. Is there other aspects of fire mimicry?
There sure are. And yeah, I mean, the fire mimicry, so like if you were going to do it at its most true and honest level, you would probably get rid of some of the mesquites around and junipers and really mimic like what would be burned in a fire. So you could even do some prescribed burning or something like that. But at our level and with our resources, this clearing the brush and getting rid of some of the lower dead and diseased arms was kind of the best that we could do under the circumstances. But yeah, you can kind of go all 9 yards. There's also things of breaking up like the roots and exposing the roots that's supposed to be really good for oaks. And yeah, and so, but yeah, for us, it was just unrealistic to try to accomplish all of that. But yeah, fire mimicry, that's, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much a lot of these landscapes we're learning need to be burned at some point. They just need to be burned, yeah, in smaller doses.
Interesting.
Cameron, Glenn again, where was your contact data? I must have missed it. It will be at phone number or email. Where am I supposed to see that, or can you give it, please?
Yeah, so it's stuck in it, but it's cbecker@alwt.org is an email. I stuck it in the chat, but I can put it in there again.
Oh, I must have missed it. At AL?
WT.org. So it's for our acronym Arizona Land and Water Trust.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, so that was going to be my question, but you kind of already answered it, Lily. If you had any plans like long term to try and bring some fire back to the landscape, but I know at that scale it's hard to do.
Yeah, and that's something that I feel like is a great thing about some of these networks, the conservation networks we're building, is that that's maybe something that can be a program on a larger scale, right? Like somebody, like another organization or our organization maybe at some point could have a facet that really focuses on prescribed burning and stuff like that. But at this point, it's also like, it's something that's like highly skilled, and it's also like, we're in an extreme severe drought that we're like, we're not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth in that way.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's something that we hear a lot, and again, it's kind of outside of wheelhouse because we mostly work on the kind of the real estate transaction. But talking to the local ranchers and other groups, that even just getting basic fire insurance for this is a non-starter. There was somebody out of like Kansas that was doing it for a while, but anyway, that's again a whole nother topic of discussion.
What do you mean by fire insurance, Cameron? Like,
yeah, so if you want, so say you had a 1,000-acre ranch, if you wanted to do a prescribed burn out there, you could probably get the crews. You could work with Department of Forestry, maybe work with the local fire department, but you can't get insurance. So say something terrible happens, you plan for everything, but it goes onto your neighbor's property or burns a structure. You have to have some sort of insurance for it, and just no real good options that I've heard of recently.
Have you looked into Firewise and their access to insurance? I think they might have some programs like that.
I'm not sure that a lot of the people, at least around like Sierra Vista, are pretty keyed into that. I've heard that name out there, so maybe they have some ideas for that. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if it involves such large tracts of land, but yeah, might be more homeowner oriented, but it's worth looking into. Yeah, that's. So do you encounter a lot of oaks, Cameron, and some of these ranches, century-old oaks? So
yeah, so definitely. So like I mentioned, we've done work with the Circle Z Ranch. So they've got a stretch of the Sonoyta Creek just downstream of what Lily was talking about, the other side of Patagonia. So there's definitely quite a bit of oaks in there. And really, so we do a lot of projects that kind of butt up against Forest Service, similar to the Wildlife Corridors property. A lot of it's more the grassland, but getting up into the foothills, you see more oaks for sure.
We had T.D. Mesquite talk about various oaks for Southeast Arizona. That's on our website as well. If you want to, anybody in the audience wants to go deeper into oaks, he talks about various different species and their care and stuff. Yeah, I love the idea of these oaks getting all trimmed up and looking really good, and it responds to that. That's a wonderful aspect of the program.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising for us too, but it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, we can't even remember the last time that these places burned, And so, yeah, and I mean, these are the last of the oaks in this canyon, and so we need them to be healthy to move forward.
I have a question for Lily. Do you guys have volunteers that you work with, or is there a program related to that for volunteers to help you with the oaks?
Yeah, we haven't had, well, it's been really tricky because most of our action steps for this particular project has been during COVID. So we haven't had any volunteer events yet, but that is actually one of the things that we are hoping to do in the future. And we'll see how long our funding sustains for this project. But yes, absolutely. We would love to have volunteers out there at some point when it's safe for everybody.
Sounds good.
I have a question. You said that the seedlings don't like being transplanted, and that you were going to try to put older plants out there that are like 3 or 4 feet tall. Do they respond better to transplanting than the younger ones, or?
Yeah, and in general, so our native plant nursery, our main focus is on the root systems, because when you produce restoration quality plants, the best thing you can possibly do is create a strong root system. And so if we can get these oaks to grow faster and also develop these hefty roots, then they're going to have a way better chance at survival. Right now, it's the seedlings and the saplings that we're planting are maybe a couple inches tall. So that's the big difference, is if you can get an established root system, you're just upping your chances of survival. And especially if you kind of pamper them right off the bat. So like not just plant them and walk away, but if we could come up with a system where we have a manageable amount of plants, like 20 to 50, then we can go out once a week and we can make sure that they have water, so that then they're further building their root system into that new soil structure, which is huge. So that's kind of the difference.
So the water is the key element. Do you fertilize, or that would come later?
So there are some fertilizers that are really specific to oaks. And we are going to maybe experiment with some of those. And I think that we have enough of the little saplings growing at the nursery at this point that we can do some different trials. Like there's one that's I think an iron-based like supplement that the oaks really, really respond to. And so I think we'll try that one and maybe a few others and just see what kind of works.
Who oversees conservation easement organizations? Is there a government body that oversees any of you? I don't mean your immediate supervisors. I'm looking at
That's a great question. So I would say the main one is there's a national group called the Land Trust Alliance. And they basically go through a really rigorous accreditation process. So it really kind of differentiates the people who have a lot of their ducks in a row and folks that are kind of just getting started, maybe necessarily. They hold a national conference, things like that. So I think that is kind of what you're talking about.
Well, just to zero in on some ludicrous examples, what if on Lily's easement, she wanted to grow Christmas trees, for her own personal profit, or on one of yours, you decided to graze your personal cattle, which would be an abuse in either case, most likely of the original intent. Who would catch that or oversee?
No, so that's a good point. So I'm our stewardship team at Arizona Land Water Trust. So I'm the one that goes out and makes sure that those terms are being met. But say Fish and Wildlife Service put up some of the funding for it, they're really interested in, say, monarch habitat or something like that. We would typically then, the reports that I would compile, we'd send to them. They'd maybe want to come out once every couple of years as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So it really just depends, because they're all kind of different. So Department of Agriculture is one of our big funding sources. So a lot of times we'll be reporting back to them and they keep tabs on it as well.
So to both of you, in both cases, your monitoring programs are whatever you want them to be. And they would be thematically based on what theme you are trying to enhance, I imagine.
Yeah, and so that's a really important thing. So actually, the Arizona Land Water Trust was created in 2007. It was actually a merger between two other land trusts, and a big part of that was, one land trust was really set up well, had set up kind of endowments to protect these properties in perpetuity, and the other one didn't have as much of those financial resources kind of lined out. So they folded together to create one strong organization that was able to uphold those permanent responsibilities, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question.
All right, well, if we have no further questions, I want to thank everybody for coming today. It was really fun and interesting. And tell your friends if they missed it, that it'll be on our YouTube channel. And let me see if that's on this last slide. It's actually not, but you can look for University of Arizona, Cochise County Cooperative Extension Waterwise. It's a lot of search terms, but you'll find us. And this will be up perhaps in a week or so for other people to enjoy. So yeah, thank you so much, both of you. I like the way your talks kind of intertwine. That worked out really well. I was glad about that we thought of having you both on together. I appreciate you coming. And all right, we will let you get on with your day or your lunches unless anyone has any parting comments.
Thank you, Marianne. That was great.
You're welcome. So much fun. And
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you both. And thank you, Connie, for helping out today. Great. Well, we'll see you at the next one. We have two more talks coming up next. One is on agaves, which is also with Francesca Clavery from Borderlands Restoration, talking about increasing agave plants for bats. It's going to be awesome. And another one about mosquitoes and standing water and the issues around mosquitoes and the potential risk associated with mosquitoes for you water harvesters in particular. So those are coming right up. Check our website. All right, everybody, thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time. All right, take care.